Thank you again, Andrew, for that. That was fantastic. Start the day with a brilliant overview of all the various bits and pieces and areas of apologetics. And the other talks through the day now will be slightly more specific, so addressing individual issues. So, the early church and the deity of Christ. This is my talk, by the way, that's why I'm here. Or did Jesus become God at the Council of Nicea? This is, I have to confess to being a church history geek. I love the whole church history thing. It's not everyone's cup of tea, but there's an apologist, an American apologist and debater by the name of James White. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of him. He's great. He's full of grace and full of compassion for the people he debates, but he speaks to everybody and anybody, Muslims and Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons and atheists, anybody that will debate him. And he says the two fields of study that have helped him most in his apologetic journey and his debates and things like that, not systematic theology or anything, it's been Greek and church history. I don't want to try and teach you Greek, because I don't think we've got time and I don't know myself. So, two minor obstacles. So, I wanted to focus on one very specific area of church history here. There can be no doubt that Jesus Christ is the most influential man who has ever walked the planet. His life, his death, and his resurrection immeasurably changed the world, completely changed the world as we know it, more than we could possibly put down on a lot of pieces of paper. And non-Christians, whatever their beliefs, they have a variety of responses to Jesus. There are a lot of different ways that people will deal with the idea of Jesus. Some people will deny that he existed at all, in any form. You know, they think he might be a myth or a legend or something that was made up by some, shady characters, like you see on films, all these men in dark rooms with cigars and brandy plotting to take over the world and coming up with these crazy ideas to then try and manipulate the world around them. Whether to give credence to their own beliefs or their own teachings or to change the way that the world is. These people, they can roughly be grouped together under the title of Jesus mythicists, okay? And in serious academia, it's not an idea that's got very much weight anymore. People don't tend to take it that seriously. The majority of academics will say, there was a man called Jesus. He was born about 2,000 years ago. He was a preacher and a teacher, and he was killed by Pontius Pilate. They'll accept that. The evidence of that is overwhelming. But then when you get to the part where we say, and he was God, and he died, and he came back, and he ascended to heaven, they have trouble with that. Out of the many responses that atheists and people of almost any religious persuasion will have to the idea of Jesus being God, one of the many responses that it's gaining a lot of popularity. And it's growing and growing. You'll find it in almost every walk of life now, is the idea that Jesus was an ordinary man and a great teacher. And then in the 4th century, there was this big council meeting. And all these people got together and had a vote and went, we're going to start calling Jesus God. 300 years after he's died, we're going to start calling Jesus God. This Council of Nicea, it did happen in 325 AD. It was a real event. Very briefly, I don't want to get bogged down in the details of it, but very briefly, the Council of Nicea was the first ever ecumenical council. We're pulling out all the big words. The first ever ecumenical council. An ecumenical council is just a council that gathers together churches from, ostensibly from all over the planet, but, gathers together as many churches as you can and gets all the bishops together and they discuss and they debate and they try and decide on matters of contention. They try and resolve disputes. They try and look at ways forward on different issues. And it was the first ever ecumenical council with a common aim, or a set of common aims. It was called by the Roman Emperor Constantine. There's a lot of division over whether or not Constantine was actually a Christian. He had some kind of experience. He started to describe himself as a Christian. Some people say that he remained a pagan until the day he died and he worshipped the sun and everything like that. But some people say that it was a political idea to pull the Council of Nicea together. None of that is really relevant. All that matters is we know that Constantine, the Roman emperor, called the Council of Nicea together, and he invited every bishop in the known world. At the time, there were about 1,800 of them. And about 300 of them turn up. He offered to pay for their travel, and he offered to, put them up and feed them and everything like that. And about 300 bishops arrived in Nicaea for this enormous council. One of the matters for discussion was a new teaching by a man named Arius. Arius had come out and said, well, Jesus is, we see him in the Bible, and he's magnificent, and he's exalted. He didn't deny any of that. Jesus, he's powerful, and he's perfect, and he died, and he rose again, and he ascended to heaven at the right hand of the Father. But what Arius was saying was, all that is true, but he's not God. It's very similar to what Jehovah's Witnesses believe now. I mean, they're basically just Arians. They say, Jesus is an exalted creature and the first of God's creations, but he's not God himself. And according to most versions of this theory, up until 325 AD, they'll say, no one thought Jesus was God. Nobody believed that he was God. They just, they thought that he was a great man. They thought that he was very special. They thought that he was very important. And then all of a sudden, these people all got together and they voted and they forced this idea on the world. They pushed this idea out, and all of a sudden, everybody had to believe it because the Emperor Constantine decided it was the case. And if anybody gives us an objection of any sort or a question of any sort, the first thing we have to ask is it true? We can't just automatically dismiss something out of hand. Is it true? Did this really happen? Now, if this was true, just if, I'd be the first one to admit that the best thing we could all do is go home and rethink our lives. Because the deity of Christ is one of the absolute bedrocks and foundations of our faith. If he isn't God, everything that we believe is a sham. There's a cheerful thought for you. If he's not God, we've got no hope. If this is some kind of conspiracy theory or something, we really should just go home and rethink our lives. This is an argument that is just very confidently and very strongly forwarded by so many different groups. So many different groups. You'll find it on atheist websites. You'll find it being spouted by Muslims, Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons. A few weeks ago, I was in Cardiff city centre on my lunch, and I was stopped in the street by a Hare Krishna monk. Are they monks? I believe they are. And he used this argument. I asked him what he thought of Jesus. Oh, yeah, he was a great man. I said, but do you believe he was God? No. He said no. And you could see his cogs ticking. What have I been told? What have I been told? You see, he said, Jesus was just a man. And the Council of Nicea. And I was on my lunch. I was in a rush to get back, so I didn't have time to engage him properly on it. But it's everywhere. And you will probably, if you get into more and more conversations with people, you'll probably hear this trotted out because it sounds a little bit convincing. It's spread like wildfire because it's useful to people who want to undermine the truth of the deity of Christ. It's a handy little sort of go-to. Whether it's a Muslim who needs to undermine the teachers of the Bible for the sake of the Quran, whether it's a Jehovah's Witness who wants to undermine Jesus so that they can put the watchtower in his place. They have turned the watchtower into Jesus. They just don't realize it. Just a few examples. I had to be careful when I was preparing this because when I first started, it was a serious case of death by quote. I had dredged up dozens of quotes on either side of the argument, and I basically would have just ended up standing here reading excerpts of books to you for 40 minutes. But we do need a couple, just so you know that I'm not making this up. There's a book called 26 Reasons Why Jews Don't Believe in Jesus by Asher Norman. Does what it says on the tin, I think. He writes in there, many early Gentile Christians did not believe that Jesus was a deity. In the year 325 AD, Emperor Constantine convened a church council at Nicea in Turkey and ordered the Gentile bishops to decide the status of Jesus for his new state religion. At Nicea, Jesus was elected God by a vote of 218 to 2. There's a Muslim website called Answering Christianity. On there's an article called The False Jesus of Christianity. We read, the title Christ was distorted by the Catholic Church to justify the pagan doctrine of the Incarnation, which later developed into the Trinity. According to history, the Council of Nicea deified Jesus and changed his status. The doctrine of the Incarnation is, in a nutshell, it's the Christian teaching that God became man in flesh in Jesus Christ. That's all it is. So he's saying that the Council of Nicea made Jesus God. From the Jehovah's Witness publication, Should You Believe the Trinity? They have a section on the Council of Nicea where they say, Constantine's role was crucial. After 2 months of furious religious debate, this pagan politician intervened and decided in favor of those who said that Jesus was God. Now, my next quote is from the Da Vinci Code. I know it's not meant to be a history textbook. I use it because... Actually, I'll give you the quote first and then I'll explain why I used it. So this is from a character called Lee Teabing. I don't know how many of you read the Da Vinci Code or seen the film? Shame on you. I totally stole that joke from Michael Ramsden. I cannot tell a lie. The Da Vinci Code. Lee Teabing. At the Council of Nicea, many aspects of Christianity were debated and voted upon. The date of Easter, the role of the bishops, the administration of the sacraments, and, of course, the divinity of Jesus. Until that moment in history, Jesus was viewed by his followers as a mortal prophet, a great and powerful man, but a man nonetheless. Jesus' establishment as the Son of God was officially proposed and voted on by the Council of Nicea. I'm using the Da Vinci Code simply because, for one thing, a lot of people either know it or have read it or know somebody who has. And also because that's kind of a good summary of the argument that you will find all over the place. It just kind of crystallizes it into one nice little example. The author, Dan Brown, he claims that although it's a work of fiction, it is based on history. He does claim that. He says, yeah, it's a work of fiction, but this stuff really happened. And he cites some of the books that he uses, that he used as his historical research. You know those kind of books that you'll see, they tend to be very big and very thick and very imposing looking, and they'll have like a dark image on the front, and they might be, and they all have these really sort of mystic sounding titles, the Hiram key and things like that, and they all sound very... he used books like that as his historical research. He cites a book called The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, and he cites another book, The Templar Revelation. Sounds like a cheap sort of thriller film, doesn't it? The Templar Revelation. But these books are trotted out because I think people want to believe conspiracies. And I think people want to grasp a conspiracy and use it as evidence that Christianity can't be true. And the other reason I use it, and I'm not proud of this, the other reason I use it is when I was an atheist and I was a bit bitter and a bit angry and a bit of a sulk about everything in general, I read the Da Vinci Code and I swallowed that hook, line, and sinker. I absolutely took that on board and I used it in arguments. And I thoroughly endorsed that view. And I thought it was great. I thought it was the cat's pajamas. I really did. I thought it was true, not because I'd done any research into it. I thought it was true because I wanted it to be true. We're talking about a book that has sold in excess of 80 million copies around the world. It's been translated into, I can't remember, some 20-odd languages, perhaps even more. Now, it's sold that many copies. The people who've got that book may well have loaned it to a friend or given it to somebody. It may have gone into a charity shop and been bought by somebody else. So we don't know how many tens of millions of people have read that around the world. And then it was turned into a film, which I believe did very well. So a lot of people saw the film. There are people walking around right now who are stumbling towards a Christless eternity, blind and ignorant of the truth, in part because they've taken a work of fiction and used it as a basis for their belief about the early church. Now, I'm not saying that's the only brick in the wall. What I'm saying is that's one of them. There are people who think that Dan Brown has given them the truth about the early church, and they're denying Christ with that as one part of their evidence. So how are we to respond? How can we respond? When something like this is trotted out, because they've got names and dates, it sounds very authentic, doesn't it? The Emperor Constantine at the Council of Nicea in 325 AD, and you think, that sounds like it came out of a textbook. That sounds like it's got some solid research behind it. Our answer is simple. The argument we're being presented with is a historical one. So we look at the historical sources. And we're into the church history. When I started, as I said at the beginning, when I started preparing for this, my issue wasn't so much, where am I going to find my sources? What can I use to back up my position? My problem was more, out of all of the stuff that's available, which bits am I going to cherry pick? Now, you may be wondering, before we fly into my various quotes and slides and things, you may be wondering why I don't build a case from the Bible. Obviously, that's the most logical place to look for the deity of Christ, the evidence that he is God. As part of and this is in the Da Vinci Code as well, as part of this whole conspiracy theory thing, there's also another bit that's sort of tagged onto it very regularly that says, so they voted on Jesus, they decided he was God, and then they changed the Bible, or they decided which books were going to be in the Bible, and they burned all the other copies, and they changed it. So the Bible that you hold in your hand now was put together at the Council of Nicea to support this teaching that they've got about Jesus. So we wouldn't believe that the Bible isn't valid in this argument, but to begin with the objection, we need to say, okay, you believe that. You believe that the Bible's changed. You believe that Jesus wasn't God. You believe that nobody believed it before the Council of Nicea. That's where you're coming from. So first of all, we have to answer the question, did the Council of Nicea invent the idea that Jesus was God? I'll be putting lots of quotes on the screen. Don't worry about writing them down or anything like that. If you're interested, I've printed out copies. There's a copy on the table over there if you want to take them away and, lose them down the back of your sofa or something. So here we go. Let's delve into just a couple of the historical sources. First place we can look is in the writings of a man called Origen of Alexandria. Origen has been described as the greatest genius that the early church ever produced. He wrote over, I thought this was a mistype, so I had to look in a few different places. He wrote over 2,000 books and articles and treatises on biblical interpretation, spirituality, biblical exegesis, theology, everything related. He wrote over 2,000 things. You didn't see that, okay? One of his books, and possibly the most important, was a book called On First Principles. On First Principles was the church's first systematic theology. A systematic theology, I've got a couple of systematic theology textbooks, and they look like the kind of thing that could stop a rhino. They're in-depth works where the author will delve into the Bible and pull out all of the scriptures relevant to different topics like baptism, sin, the Holy Spirit, deity of Christ, all the different teachings. They'll pull out all the scriptures and look at them all together and then say, all of these together seem to teach X, Y, Z. So rather than saying, this one verse says that about baptism, they pull it all together and say the whole Bible teaches this about this topic. So he wrote the first systematic theology. And in this book, Origen said, I went to the wrong slide. In this book, Origen said, although Christ was God, he took flesh, and having been made man, he remained what he was, God. That's about as clear as you can get, really. He hasn't pulled any punches. He hasn't been a little bit he hasn't skirted around the issue. Jesus Christ was God, he said. Perhaps the end of the argument. Unfortunately, if we relied on just this, there are a couple of objections that we could meet. Firstly, Origen was writing about 200 years after Jesus was crucified. So maybe this idea developed over time. Maybe nobody believed it before Origen, then the people at Nicea just picked up what Origen said and ran with it. Maybe it was something that only Origen believed. Maybe he was some raving loony sitting in his garden shed howling at the moon, And he had this wacko idea, but nobody else really thought it. So we could look a little bit earlier. Melito of Sardis, who was a bishop in Western Turkey, and about 170 AD. So, sorry, Origen wrote his book in about 220 to 230 AD. Melito of Sardis, 50 years earlier, wrote a letter to the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius. If you've seen Gladiator, he really did exist. That's about the only historical accuracy in that film, was his name. So various charges had been laid against Christians. And Melito of Sardis, he just wrote this letter to the emperor to explain away some of the charges, to defend them, and partly to explain some of the Christian beliefs as well. So he wrote, "We are not those who pay homage to idols, but to the only God who is before all and over all. Moreover, we are worshippers of Christ, who is truly God, the Word existing before all time." Pretty comprehensive, pretty convincing. Then he wrote on the nature of Christ. "For the deeds done by Christ after his baptism, and especially his miracles, give indication and assurance to the world of the deity hidden in human flesh. For being at once both God and perfect man, he gave us sure indications of his two natures." So, now we're 100 years before the Council of Nicea. 150 years, before the Council of Nicea. And Melito of Sardis and Origen, and I can't labour this point enough. These are two out of hosts and scores of references we could have pulled out. They're very clearly saying, Jesus is God. Jesus is God. Jesus is God in the flesh. God came in flesh. Jesus is God come in the flesh. We believe that he's God. We worship him as God. Jesus is God. The whole Council of Nicea thing is starting to look a little bit shaky. But what if... Now, we're working really on the what if, because whenever you're presenting any kind of argument for anything biblical, really, if somebody's really digging their heels in, they go, well, what if X, Y, Z? What if the aliens put it there? You know? Yeah. What if? What if this was a myth? What if this was a legend that grew up over time? This is something that you'll see on blogs. The internet is such a magnificent thing. It is an incredible resource. It is an incredible invention. It is a wonderful, wonderful gift to humanity. The small problem is anybody can go on there and write anything they want, and then some people will go on there and believe everything they read straight away. This isn't relevant, but just as an illustration. How's my time looking? Just a quick illustration. I was sitting next to a chap in work, very, very intelligent guy, you know, first in maths from Cardiff University, and just very, very sharp, very, very, very clever. And it was coming up to Christmas, and he made some offhand comment about, Christians just stole it, you know, from a pagan festival. Well, actually, they did. Oh, no, they did. No, they did. And he went to Google. Look, it's written by they. Should we have a look at a site that says that they didn't? Would you believe that? Oh, no, Christians stole it. I instantly believed it because it was on Google. Gets my back up a bit. But atheist bloggers and things will go and say, well, it was a myth, it was a legend. C.S. Lewis, actually, who Andrew mentioned earlier, and you must know. C.S. Lewis, who was a professor at Oxford, and he was a professor of literature, and he wrote a book on medieval literature, and it took him, I think it was something like 10 years to write it. And somebody said, well, how come it took you so long to write it? He said, well, I couldn't write a book on medieval literature without reading everything that was written in the Middle Ages first. And he read all the stories that were written in the Middle Ages. So he's pretty thorough. And he said about the Gospels, they don't read like myths and legends. Now, if anybody knows, it's him. They don't read like myths and legends, he said. They read like first-hand accounts. But what if, somebody might say, what if they're myths and legends, you know? Can you go any earlier? Can you go a bit further back? I'm glad you asked. We've got Melito of Sardis. We've got Origen. We've gone about 150 years before the Council of Nicea. There was a church father by the name of Ignatius, who was a bishop of Antioch. Now, there's a traditional belief, fairly well evidenced, but we're not sure. There's a traditional belief that he was a disciple of the Apostle John. So we're knocking on the door of the Bible now, okay? It's pretty likely, but it's not definite. But then he was friends with Polycarp, who we're 99.9% certain was a disciple of John. So Ignatius is like, he's up there, basically, but he's with an apostle. So if you're going to get teaching about who and what Jesus was, this is about as close as you can get without going to the Bible itself. In about 107 AD, Ignatius was arrested and he was taken on a long journey to Rome, where he was ultimately executed. And on his journey, he wrote 6 letters to various churches. Here are just a few of the mentions that he makes of Jesus. I love this one in particular. There is one physician who is possessed of both flesh and spirit, both made and not made, God existing in flesh, even Jesus Christ our Lord, in his letter to the Ephesians. Another excerpt from letter to the Ephesians. For our God, Jesus Christ, was born to the appointment of God, conceived in the womb by Mary, of the seed of David, by the Holy Ghost. He said in his letters to the Romans, for our God, Jesus Christ, now that he is with the Father, is all the more revealed in his glory. Letter to the Smyrnians, I believe that's pronounced. I glorify Jesus Christ, our God, who made you so wise. This is a disciple of an apostle who walked with Jesus in 170 AD, over 200 years before the Council of Nicea. There are a couple of things to note about his letters as well. For one thing, when he talks about Jesus being God, or when he makes any mention of God coming in flesh and things like that, it's not presented as an argument. He's not trying to evidence it. He's not trying to convince anyone. He just mentions it almost in passing, as if it's part of the normal flow of the letter. It's just sort of slots in there. He's not trying to convince anyone, so the people that he's writing to, it's safe to assume, already agree with him. He's not trying to tell, you've got to believe that Jesus is God. Another thing to note is that if you look at the churches that he wrote his letters to, they spread out across Greece and Turkey, and he writes a letter to Rome as well. So the people that he's writing to already believe that Jesus is God, and he's writing to churches over a wide area. Now, the ancient world, like Turkey and Greece and Rome, across that expanse of land, that's unthinkable. That's a huge area for one belief to be shared so early after the death and resurrection of Christ. News doesn't travel all that quickly in the ancient world. We get so used to, I think, when we look at history, we sort of look at it with our own understanding of the way that the world works now, and we forget that the world was so different back then. It's an obvious thing to say, but news and beliefs and ideas would have spread quite slowly. And here we are, 70 years after the death of Jesus, and people all across this massive expanse of land already believe the truths that are in the Bible. Now, if someone was being unreasonably stubborn, which you will encounter, they could say, well, these books and letters, they don't really represent what all the church believed. In a way, that's true, because there were controversies, there were heresies, there were all of these arguments in the early church. But the majority of Christian history shows that people have clung to these orthodox beliefs all the way down the line. But then they could say, well, this is a biased sample. A charge of bias is a very funny thing, because it's usually made by somebody who's being biased. Not always. Again, I was trying to remember where I read it. I wanted to bring up the article that I brought. I wanted to reference it. I'm going to look for it. So if anybody, if I find it, I'll email everybody here and let you know, because it was brilliant. But there was another atheist website. He said, we couldn't trust what the early church fathers wrote because they're Christians, so they were biased. Right. Isn't that a bit biased? Isn't that a slightly biased way to... You instantly can't trust what they're saying because they're Christians, so they're biased. Okay. But the main point of his argument, that was just kind of, that was part of his argument. The main point of his argument was, if Jesus was really resurrected, if the things written in the Gospels were true, then there would be lots of non-Christians who would have written about it. If Jesus was really God existing in the flesh, a lot of other religions would have left books about him as well. If someone in the time of Jesus had either heard a convincing story about him doing these miracles or had been there and witnessed themselves, and if they had seen him hanging on the cross, butchered and mocked and ridiculed and tortured and a horrible mess, and then saw him 3 days later walking around again, and then saw him ascend to heaven, is he suggesting that those people then would have gone off and written about it and then not believed? So, no, we're not going to be able to produce non-Christian writings that attest to the fact that Jesus is God and that he died and was resurrected. We're not going to. Because surely people that witnessed it, if I was there would be nothing that stopped me. And I'm sure it's true of everybody here. If you were there and you saw him resurrected 3 days after he'd been killed and he was preaching then, not a thing no known power in the universe could have stopped you from throwing yourself at his feet and worshipping him as God. But what we can do is there are records that non-Christians have left us in the time just after Jesus who can tell us how Christians acted and lived. So they're slightly removed, but they've got no bias. They've got nothing to gain. They're not trying to prove anything. Christians were a bit of a puzzle in the Roman Empire because people didn't know what to do with them. Because some people called them atheists because they didn't believe in all the Roman gods. They were generally persecuted, sometimes terribly, sometimes tortured and killed. Most of the time just kind of scorned and looked down on and mocked and things like that. But there were periods of terrible persecution. And it was an awful life for them. Lucian, a Greek playwright, wrote this about Christians in about 160 AD. Their first lawgiver, so Jesus, persuaded them that they were all brothers of one another, after they had transgressed once for all by denying the Greek gods and by worshipping that crucified man himself and living under his laws. So a Greek playwright who's clearly not a Christian is talking about Christians worshipping Jesus as God. There was a Roman ruler called Pliny the Younger who was at a complete loss as to what to do with Christians. In about 112 AD, some Christians were brought to him on charges, we're not sure what. And he questioned them and he threatened them and he was asking them, are you Christians? Are you Christians? And he asked them 3 times. He says, I asked them, and he says, I interspersed it with threats. And when they continually said, yes, they are Christians, he executed them for no particular reason other than he found them to be stubborn and disrespectful in their beliefs. Obstinate, he called them in his letter. So he executed them. But then as more Christians were brought to him on different charges, he started to wonder whether he was allowed to just go around executing people. He wasn't the emperor. He was like a local governor. And he started killing people. Then he thought, I should probably check whether or not I can get away with this. So he wrote to the Emperor Trajan, who was the same person who executed Ignatius. He wrote to him, and at one point in his letter, he described what little he knew of their behavior. He wrote, they were wont on a certain day to meet together before it was light and to sing a hymn to Christ as to a god. Once a Jehovah's Witness said to me, because they say that Jesus is a god, not the God, they said, but Pliny called him a god. Pliny was a Roman. He believed that there were dozens or hundreds or thousands of gods. So to him, the idea that there was one God was ridiculous. But what he did recognize was that Jesus was being treated and worshipped as a god by the Christians. So, just to summarize, I threw lots of quotes at you, and like I said, there are copies over there, but there's a belief that the idea that Jesus was God was just trotted out at a council in 325 AD. Nobody believed it before that. And some people will then say, the Bible was changed, and they gathered all the copies together and burnt them, and that's... next time we do this, because we are doing this again, next time we do this, I'm going to go into the whole sort of transmission of the Bible thing. I love all that as well, but this idea that somehow in a world with no mass communications, no real form of transport, no real form of any anything like the government organization that we've got now. The idea that somebody could gather together all of the existing copies of the Bible and destroy them. It's like, imagine you had no phones, no computers, no forms of long-term communication, nothing like that. And then everybody said to you, I want you to gather together every single Bible in Cardiff and destroy it. Well, how would you possibly do it? Especially if people didn't want to hand it over. Have you got a Bible? No. Oh. Well, I'm going to believe you because I have to, because I've got no choice. The idea that they could gather together every existing scripture and destroy them is the most absurd thing in the world, and yet it's confidently trotted out. It's one of my bugbears. Those are just a few of the hundreds of historical resources that show that Jesus was specifically and repeatedly called God. And then we have non-Christians describing how Christians worshipped him as God. We can say with every confidence that from the very beginning, Jesus was worshipped. Christians have always believed this. It wasn't that it was some sort of weird conspiracy by men in a dark room with cigars and brandy. It wasn't some bizarre little conspiracy theory. We have absolute confidence that this was always the case. And then we can turn to the scriptures and say, we can turn to John 20:28, where Thomas saw Jesus with the nail marks in his wrist and the spear wound in his side. And he fell down and he said, my Lord and my God. We can then pull out the Bible and we can spend all day looking at all of the evidence in there that Jesus is God. My Lord and my God. There's no doubt. This Council of Nicea thing, you probably will encounter it at some point if you talk to enough non-believers, but it's nonsense. Now, I'm going to ask if there are any questions, but before I do, I'm going to be brutally honest. If you ask me something and I don't know the answer to it, I'm just going to say I don't know, because I don't want to try and fudge my way through it and then misinform you and then look back 5 years' time, especially if this is being recorded, and think, probably shouldn't have said that. So you'll have to forgive me if I can't give an answer. If any of you do have a question, I'll do my best, but if not, then if anybody asks, I did answer it and it was a really good answer. But I realize it's very niche. I realize it's a very narrow field of study. But does anybody have any questions? You're being kind to me. Fantastic. In which case, we're about on time for lunch.